So moving on, you talked about like how the ISO framework was, uh, it's sort of detailed formulations of more on the principles that was underpinned on within the GLEC framework. So talking about that, like, do you think that the ISO framework fit into the whole landscape alongside alongside or in conjunction with the GLEC framework, the ISO standard, or is it like a more of an extension of the GLEC framework? Does it cover much more broader areas than what is currently covered within the GLEC framework?
I see the two documents, ISO 14083 and the GLEC framework, as complementary to each other. The area that is covered is largely the same. Any differences in coverage would be marginal at this point, and that's partly because we have just released a third version of the GLEC framework, which has a slightly expanded boundary that would now, for example, include pipelines, which weren't previously included in the GLEC framework, but which were included in the ISO standard. So it's set very much on on the same set of principles as we just discussed. But the ISO, just the nature of a standard, means that it goes into a more formal and formulaic way of looking at the issue. And that is very useful in some respects when you're thinking about setting out the legal aspects of a policy, or to set up verification criteria for an assurance scheme. The extra level of detail within the ISO 14083 does help to clarify that and make that extremely rigid in terms of how you set up calculations. But it can also be really off-putting and make it harder to understand for a newcomer who comes to this topic and isn't experienced. And that's really where we hope the GLEC framework comes into its own, because it was developed in collaboration with industry partners with the objective of making the topic accessible and available to all. And we've tried very hard to continue this with each new version of the GLEC framework. Now, just working on the language and the way it's presented, which is why I think that it's a question of the two documents being complementary to each other. I think the existence of ISO 14083 will quite likely mean that many more people and organisations will take note of the need to calculate and report the greenhouse gas emissions from their freight transport and logistics. But I suspect that the GLEC framework is likely to be a way that many of those who come new to the topic will get to grips with what they have to do and why. And it may well then be that they look to the ISO standards or employ specialists who need that extra level of detail for the final details. But I really suspect that the GLEC framework will be the entry route for the vast majority of people.
So from a first user's perspective, like what would be your recommendations? Should they start with the GLEC framework, or they should deep dive into the ISO standard? And from a company's perspective also, like when they are doing their verification on this to make sure that they're completely in alignment, what they should focus on, the current GLEC version 3, or they should focus on the ISO standard?
I think a company that is coming to the topic for the first time, I think the easiest way to start would be to read the GLEC framework, because of the way that the language is set out and it's designed to follow that. At Smart Freight Centre, we have also been working over the past 12 months on a set of verification criteria and an assurance scheme that would match up to the GLEC framework and ISO 14083. So a company that is thinking about getting their calculations verified, I suggest that would then be the way for them to move forward, to look at that assurance scheme and take it from there. There may well be the need for them to get some additional support, but there are a lot of calculation tools out there, they could look to provide that support. We've been working with many for a number of years now, since the GLEC framework was first developed, who we've been checking to see whether or not they are applying the methodology and are correct. And those calculation tool partners would be a good way also for a company to implement calculations without having to really do much of the heavy lifting themselves.
And based on your perspective, do you think all these businesses are adequately prepared for, the requirements for the compliance, as well as the setting, making sure that they are in alignment with what it's gonna be the new upcoming regulations?
I think that's a very interesting question, actually. Some companies are definitely going to be prepared, and I think many of those are the leaders who've engaged with Smart Freight Centre so far. Our membership has increased rapidly, as has the number of organisations that have approached us over the past couple of years. But I think we still need to be realistic that we're still talking to a relatively small proportion of the total number of businesses that are active in the sector, because there are a relatively small number of large businesses who have a big impact, but there are many, many smaller businesses. And my concern is that this majority are probably not that well prepared at this stage, certainly not fully. And with that in mind, I think there will be some challenges for the sector as a whole that will need to be borne in mind by any organisations that put in requirements for compliance, legislation, and the like. So probably some form of transition arrangements, and it'll be interesting to see how they develop. And thinking also about the Smart Freight Centre Academy, I think that means that there will be a big need in the future for training programs at introductory level, but then also at more detail, understanding how to calculate and then how to use the results of those calculations to decarbonize their operations, either directly or within a broader supply chain.
When we talk about decarbonizing the operations, the logistic operations, and a lot of these companies are newcomers, as you mentioned, or they're not aware of what are the regulations or what are the processes that are need to be taken while doing all these steps. What would be the potential repercussions, according to you, for these companies if they don't comply with all these frameworks that are out there while dealing with decarbonizing their logistic operations?
I think the repercussions depend on how the larger companies and the policymakers decide to act over the next 2 or 3 years. There's no doubt that the pressure to take action on decarbonisation is growing. And that's coming from a number of different perspectives. It's coming from legislation, but it's also coming from societal pressure. It's coming from investors who are themselves coming under pressure to understand what they're doing with their money and report that. And so those investors, as shareholders in the bigger companies, are themselves asking many more questions than was previously the case. I think right now, the use of emission calculations in decarbonisation action is voluntary. And so you might say, well, the repercussions right now are probably relatively small, but I think this is changing rapidly. Even with an expanded voluntary framework, it would take only a few of the larger companies, large-scale purchasers of freight transport services, to decide to require the use of low-emission transport services, and that would give a really strong market signal to their suppliers need to calculate, report as a first step to carbonisation. But they'll need to do that, because if they don't do that, they won't actually know whether or not the actions that they take are having an impact. But within that business to business environment, transport operators that don't act effectively, they just risk losing out to other competitors who are able to fulfill those new obligations and to be transparent and to take action. I'm not saying it will be an easy thing by any means, but access to capital within that, whether that's individual operators accessing capital or whether it's a shared approach to investment between the customer and the operator, will also be at the heart of that. And that's why I think the role of financiers in stimulating the sector will be really important as well. And then you also have the role of legislators, because as soon as legislation comes in, then you're not dealing with a voluntary framework. You're dealing with something which is much more compulsory. And there's a consolidation between environmental and financial reporting mechanisms going on to form a single framework. And I think that itself could have far-reaching consequences, because if the same rigor and legislative requirements are placed on greenhouse gas reporting as are placed on financial reporting, that would really drive transparency. It would be a massive change. And then that would potentially drive rapid developments compared to those that have been in place over the past 10 years through the voluntary framework, as we've been working on putting the calculation and reporting frameworks in place. So once you get into that, I think then the repercussions become much bigger, and smaller companies will definitely be challenged, and then it'll be interesting to see what support mechanisms are put in place as well.
Alan, you talked about how important is for the legislators and the policies when we are dealing with all these frameworks and their compliance towards it. Do you still see a need of, increased standardization of regulations on a global scale? Because I can imagine, like, when it comes to all these regulations, each countries have a set of different regulations on the compliance of the transport operations, and how they deal with if these statements are voluntary on calculations of their logistics emissions. So do you think how important is to make sure that all these policies or all these regulations are completely aligned, and to make sure, like, what do you think the Smart Freight Center could take the steps for, to make sure that all these regulations are set in a single piece?
Yeah, so I mean, logistics, the starting point, logistics is a global industry. It links together trade from all different parts of the world and enables the goods to flow. So in that, with that as a starting point, global standardization of regulations is really important in all aspects of how that sector works. You see it already in the maritime and the air transport sectors, where you have the IMO and ICAO really acting as that sort of global body that legislates and brings the industry together at global level. So there's definitely the precedent for that, and I think that's really important. And at Smart Freight Centre, we've also always tried to take that view. I mean, the clue's there in the name, Global Logistics Emissions Council, and the production of ISO 14083, which was signed up to by more than 60 national standards organizations, again shows the importance of that international perspective, because it's got the greenhouse gas committees of ISO within which ISO 14083 sits. It's got countries represented from strong developed countries in the global north right the way through to less developed countries and countries from global south in there as well. So it's really important from that perspective to take that global view. You see even within Europe fragmentation about some regulations at national level about how operation happens and how certain vehicles might be allowed in one country or not in another, and that causes problems even within Europe at national boundaries. So anything that we can do to harmonize whatever regulation in a global industry, I think is really important. I'm hopeful that because greenhouse gas reporting from the logistics sector is still relatively new in its infancy, by putting in place GLEC framework and the ISO standard, that companies and countries that come to it new, wherever they are in the world, can save themselves a lot of time and unnecessary pain by embracing the standards that we've already put in place, rather than reinventing the wheel in this regard. I think Smart Freight Centre then has a role in promoting what we've been doing for the last 10 years to relatively new regions to us. And I think that's one of the developments that we see as an organisation. A lot of our work to date has been focused on working with companies and policymakers in Europe, North America. Obviously, we've been in China for a long time since we were formed as well. But as we've grown, it's become easier for us as an organisation to work maybe in other countries. So as you know, we're now starting to work in India, in parts of Africa. I think thinking about Latin and South America as well. And I think we can help by maybe to short circuit some of the processes and avoid wasting time and effort by taking a ready-made solution, at least on the greenhouse gas calculation and decarbonisation perspective, to some of these areas.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for telling a lot about how the legislations and the policy can move forward while aligning together, and also talking about the GLEC framework and the ISO 14083.